In mathematics, we expect that students have all had the same material. So if you're in 8th grade algebra or 9th grade algebra, you should know these things, which is a lie. Nobody ever comes into the room with the same things. Teachers have the assumption that all my students must have these things, and if you don't, that's not my problem. That's a really bad take. I guess I wish I had explored that further sooner. But when I started teaching programming, I realized some of my students have been programming for quite a bit. Some of my students have been writing lines of code or have explored Scratch for years, and they're in 6th grade. And yet, some of my students may see their first line of code in my classroom. They're all signed up for the same class. If I teach that class to the high level, I am not serving any other students. If I teach that student to the base level, those who are really excited about this will get bored and really start hating a topic that they might have loved before. So I can't teach to the course. I can't teach to the content. I can teach to the kids. I can teach creating curriculum that addresses their needs individually. And it is possible, not necessarily the easiest thing. And that's one of the reasons why I mentioned the ill-defined problem, where you provide this broad idea of what it is that you want. You know what topics you're going to be touching on. So, for example, I have the alternate history project where students are going to explore something in history. It can be sports, music, wars, whatever. They're going to choose 2 topics and they're going to create this game that's a choose your own adventure kind of game, where they're going to explore if the real thing happened, this is what goes next. But what if it didn't? Then that is an alternate route, right? So it's an alternate dystopian kind of thing, but they have to research who was there, who wasn't. And I mentioned what if Prince was an actor and not a singer? What happens to music? And it's really interesting to think about because Prince is somebody who's had quite a bit of influence in what comes next. So if he's not there, what happens to music? Are the same people going to be in music? Are the same people going to be inspired? I don't know. But that project will look very different depending on where my students came in. So if I have a student who is a coder and has been doing it for years, their final product might be a very polished game with mini games for decision making and all of that, which is phenomenal because they're going to have enough time. If I give them 3 weeks, they're going to use those 3 weeks very differently from the student who's just now writing their first line of code, who's going to be teaching themselves. And I'm going to be doing some mini tutorials, but they're learning like, how do I use a button and how do I add the backgrounds and how do I add the characters? They're going to be focusing on something else. At the end of the day, they're all going to have practiced about statements, conditionals. They're all going to be looking at loops if they're using controllers. So how do I make sure that my arrow always works or something like that? They're going to be looking at all of those things that I wanted, even though the end result might be, the difference between a stick figure drawing and a Picasso. It's not the same, but they've met the brief. And that's where I want them to be because I don't want the student, who's just writing their first line of code to compare themselves with somebody who's been coding for 4 years. That's what I mean. I don't need them to be doing that. They're going to get there, but they can't expect to learn 4 years of coding that other person has in this one project. And some students really do learn quick and they will be coding at that level. But some students will take the whole entire year to create something that looks more polished. But I don't want them to feel like less than. Their experience has to be about your next game is going to be better. And that's where you need to focus. And if you've already learned these things, then you need to focus more maybe on character creation or whatever if it's a game design class. So I work with my students individually. And as I don't want to be intense about it either. Like, this is what you are doing and forget about everybody else. It's subtle. It's the way that we give feedback to them. It's the way that we prop them up when they're doing something great. And it's continuous. So I am looking at their computers as they're working and I call out something that's really cool on their screens. Hey, this looks amazing. Great job on blah. And it's not about that end grade because I refuse to give grades at this point. But when I did give grades, I also never would give back graded assignments, even with math in my last years. So the last years I taught math, I would refrain from giving back some of the assignments because one of the things that I think affects students intensely is if I give back a paper with a whole lot of red marks, they're not going to want to learn that again, nor will they want to improve. Psychologically and subconsciously, it kills a student. They might start thinking like, I'm no good at math, or I'm not good at whatever. And instead, what I would do is I would look at my class as a whole and say, if there's a lot of red marks for a lot of my students, then maybe I didn't teach it correctly. So I would talk to the kids and say like, hey, let's do this again. Let's look at this again. Let's partner up. And I would partner students with somebody who might have done better, but I wouldn't tell them who did well and who didn't. And we would talk more about like, let's look at the content again and let's look at it a different way. And then at the very end, I would say, you need to trust me about your grades. And if you have a question when the grades do come out, then let me know. I've only ever had 2 students actually come to me and say like, I'm not sure about that grade. And we would discuss it and see if there was a change. And I once changed it and the other I didn't. But it was very interesting that the conversations were a lot more about the content rather than the grade. So instead of how can I get a grade is how do I understand this better? I'm having trouble with. So I try to teach my students to focus on the what am I learning rather than what am I getting? And that's all about the individual process. It's about where I am and how's my growth.
This excerpt of the CSK8 podcast is from episode number 80, which is titled Individualized Learning Without Grades with Sofía De Jesús.